Hi philosophers, welcome to this video on different forms, different theories of justice, and this goes along with the chart that you can find for weeks 9 and 10 on justice is. And so it covers mostly things that come up in chapter 9, although you do have Plato making an appearance again as well. And there's a PowerPoint that goes along with this if that's more helpful to you. I'm going to go just briefly through this chart, and then I'm going to focus on three that really overlap with a lot of the debates within American politics right now, and that would be Nozick's idea about entitlement, Rawls's theory of justice as fairness, and then Marx's idea of alienation of labor. All right, so for Plato, right, and again, this comes up in chapter 8, but I put it on this theories of justice chart because it's not just about justification for government and how we pick our leaders, but his idea of meritocracy, which to a certain extent, at least, Aristotle also follows, although they have their differences. Also fits nicely, it could have gone in chapter 9 as well as a theory of justice. Right, so for Plato, again, it's all about harmony. You'll see this again when we get to Aristotle and his virtue ethics, right? So it's bringing things into balance and into harmony, right? So if each person plays their part according to their nature, right, then not only individuals will have that harmony, right, of reason and appetite and desire, but the society as a whole will have harmony. The other thing to note is that it's going to be hierarchical, right? So you're going to have those philosopher kings and queens at the top, right? And then those civil servants, right? Or warriors, and then those producers at the bottom. So the producers, it's not that they get less, they actually get the most, but they have the least control, right? They don't have control over the government, right, or over those big decisions, but they get the most in terms of, right, they get to produce and they get to consume the most. So hierarchy is not necessarily the same thing as saying if you're at the bottom you have the least, but you might still, right, have a bit of a disagreement about Plato in terms of do those, right, at the top politically, right, should they get all of the say, right? Just because they're the philosopher kings and queens, should the rest of us get no say in what decisions get made? Or maybe you say, no, those are the people who devote their lives to these decisions, and I don't want to have a say in that. All right, so that would be Plato's meritocracy. When you get to Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who is his student, and this idea of utilitarianism, so that would be your next one down. Utilitarianism, just note that it's both a sociopolitical theory and also an ethical theory under the umbrella of consequentialism. So it's focused on the consequences, and it's focused on producing the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain for everybody involved in a particular decision, right? A particular decision by the state and by a society. So for Mill, and for Bentham, his teacher, although they argued about quality and quantity, and you see that a little bit in the text, there was this idea and this real push, right, against policies, right? These were state policies like slavery, right? And so even though slavery seemed to benefit, right, a whole lot of people, the overall pain that it produced, right, far outweighed the pleasure it was producing. And so they made an argument against that. And they made an argument for women's suffrage. And so you see Harriet Taylor Mill and then her husband, John Stuart Mill, making this argument that giving the women the right to vote not just benefited women, it actually benefited everybody. Okay, so you could do a kind of utilitarian argument for or against particular kinds of policies based on do they maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Now the other thing to note for Mill that doesn't really come up in this particular textbook, you'd see it in more of a political philosophy class, is that Mill is really kind of at the forefront of libertarian thought as we might think of it today, and minimizing state, right, intrusion into our lives. And so while he's all about, right, maximizing pleasure for the greatest number of people, for him that did not equate to more and more laws, more and more regulation of citizens. So just something to note if you're thinking about using mill in other kinds of ways in or outside of this class. Okay. And then skipping down to the bottom, right? So thinking outside of that Western context, justice in Buganda. So that comes up a little bit in the chapter, and is something we might think about. Perhaps it doesn't fit our particular political context now, and perhaps it works on a much smaller scale. But their fairness is defined according to social norms, right? So it can vary from village to village, right? From, smaller culture to culture. And it's really the consensus of the elders, right? Representing various sides. So they come together, they work together, and they come to some kind of consensus, and then everybody else abides by that, right? So it's definitely not a sort of democratic push. It has a little bit of elements of meritocracy, but those given, right, charge over our decisions are really our elders, and those are the people that we trust to take care of cultural traditions, right, and knowledge and wisdom. So that's, I think, another form of social harmony. It's definitely over the needs, right, and desires of the individual. So it's kind of over and against that idea of Western thought where the individual in some ways comes first. But perhaps that's something that just works on a smaller scale. That can't quite be translated into some of our modern thought, or maybe, right, very localized now. So I want to move to sort of the three big ones that overlap with particularly the US. So I know we have international students, and you can think about whether these overlap with your political system or not. And so just being very clear that our system has elements of all three of these political philosophies, okay? And different parties, right, are going to lean more heavily on one or the other, but there's really quite a bit of a mixture. Rawls kind of representing the closest, right, to what we call modern day liberalism, which is not the same as saying you are liberal, right? And liberal meaning, say, Democrat. So liberalism, right, being that sort of larger system, larger political philosophy of protecting individual rights, okay? So he kind of represents the closest to our system, and then the other two, Nozick, right, and Marx, are kind of the two other ends that are sort of always pulling us in one direction or another each election cycle. So kind of look for these elements, right, coming up in the election, because they're all there, okay? And neither party is either, right? The Republicans are not all, right, Nozick and entitlement, and the Democrats are not all sort of Marx or even socialist at that. Both of them have elements of Rawls for sure. Okay, so I want to just kind of go through their basic ideas and then look at just one example, which is healthcare, and how the three might approach it very differently. Okay, the other thing to just constantly keep in mind is that in all of these theories, but particularly these three, right, there's always a trade-off. So anybody who tells you, right, you go by this theory, you get everything, is suppressing evidence, right? That's the particular fallacy, right? You're always going to trade off, right, some amount of individual freedom for collective and individual good, right? Otherwise, and this is where, right, you might disagree with everything else in Hobbes, but he does have a real clear point about, right, if we don't give up some of our freedoms for some protections, right, then we are in a kind of state of nature, right? So that social contract tradition says we're always giving up something, right, in order for protection of something else, okay? So we'll kind of start with Nozick. When we get to Nozick, and he's going to be very much responding, definitely to Marx, but more so at the time he was writing, he was responding to John Rawls and his Theory of Justice book that came out. And so for Nozick, it's all about citizens protecting their liberty, and so that is above equality, right, above any other good that we might identify. So citizens should not be forced to aid others. They can choose to aid others. They can even choose to set up other kind of forms of government, but at its core, right, entitlement theory says, right, when we enter into the social contract, it should only be a bare minimum to protect that which we work for. So we work for something, right, we gain that particular wealth or goods or whatever it is, and we're entitled to that. Okay, so if we choose to give it away through charity, we see the need somewhere out there, then we can choose to do so. We should never be forced to do so, because that infringes upon that most basic right of entitlement to that which we've worked for. Okay, so that's Nozick's idea. When we get to Rawls, right, he's very much in that social contract tradition of Hobbes and of Locke, and he takes that idea of the state of nature and talks about a heuristic. It's a kind of fancy philosophical term for let's think hypothetically, right? So he talks about this original position where we have a veil of ignorance, and he says whatever we would choose, right, in this original position where we don't know our race, our sex, right, our economic class, our physical ability, any of that, if we don't know any of that, whatever we would choose as a system would be a fair system. And so justice is all about choosing what is rational and fair. Okay, so there's two things that come out of that. That's the equal liberty principle and the difference principle. Okay, the first, one of the examples I use in class for the equal liberty principle is, cutting a pie or cake or sort of anything where you have to cut for multiple people. And you ask in this original position, right, if you were to give, right, the knife and say, cut this as fairly as you like, but you get the last piece, how would you cut it, right? And then I always have students who say, I don't like pie. That's not the point. So the idea is something that you like, right, that you're cutting up, but everybody else gets a piece first, right? Rawls thinks that you would rationally cut it equally so that by the time it gets to you, right, if you were to get that last piece, you would feel that it was fair. Okay, so you would cut it fairly. All along the way, you would cut it equally. And that's how he thinks about particular liberties and rights, right? So the right to, right, bodily integrity, right, being one particular example, and you can look up others. When it gets to the difference principle, right, we note that for Rawls, it's not just straight across equality. Actually, justice is about fairness. So for the difference principle, it's any social or economic inequalities need to be to everyone's advantage and attached to positions and offices open to all. Okay, so you can have inequality, but you have to think, if I was behind that veil of ignorance and I didn't know where I would be within society, would I be okay, right, ending up at the bottom? Would the bottom still be good, a decent place to be, right? And would I think and know that I could work my way to another position, right? Would those positions be open to me, regardless, right, of other kinds of differences in terms of my identity? If that's the case, then those differences are acceptable, right, for Rawls. Now we get to Marxism, and this is, I think, one of the ones that we have the most, right, misunderstanding about within our culture. So it's one of the ones that we hear the most in these political debates, but we actually know the least about Marx in terms of sort of public education out there. So for Marx, right, before you get to any of the sort of applying Marx to political systems, whether it's socialism or communism, you actually need to understand what's at the heart of his theory, and that is the connection to labor, right? And labor doesn't actually sound like as good of a word as Marx wants it to be. For him, labor is any time you use your body in connection with, right, raw materials to create something. And for him, that's what it means to be human. to be able to use our bodies, right, and create things that we're proud of, that we feel connected to, that we're not just producing in order to get money to dull ourselves, right, and distract ourselves from the fact that we're not connected to our own humanity. We're not connected to our own creativity. So for Marx, what it means to flourish is to be connected to our labor, connected to that creative side of what it means to be human, and anything that gets in the way of that. For him at the time, it was, right, smaller and smaller groups of people controlling, right, the means of production, so that people became alienated from their labor. Right? They were doing these menial tasks that were broken up in factory assembly lines, so that all you did all day was, right, screw one bolt, right, in this much larger, whatever it was, whether it was a car or something else, right, this much larger thing that was produced that had nothing to do with who you were as a human being and your creativity. It gave you a wage, right? Often not a living wage, but it gave you a wage, and you were not only not compensated, right, accordingly, but you actually, and more profoundly for Marx, you were disconnected from your own humanity. Okay. So when we think about Marx, it's for him, it's to each according to their need. What do they need? What do you need as an individual in order to connect to that creative side, to be connected to your labor, to each according to their ability, right? What is your nature? What are you supposed to be creating? Okay, so those are sort of three theories that are at the backdrop and often not interrogated philosophically. They're often, right, made into straw men, fallacies when we're talking about political debates right now. But those are the theories in the background, and what we're fighting about when we're talking about, do you want to give up certain liberties in order to protect, right, others, right? Do you give up your entitlement to everything that you buy or everything that you produce? So that you can pursue, right, being connected to your labor, right? Or is, right, keeping everything, right, that you're entitled to more important, right, than some of these other things? Or is fairness, right, your ultimate concern? And so you're willing to have some inequalities as long as they don't cross a particular line, as long as you're not wanting to be at the very bottom, and you'd be, if you're not okay with what that bottom position is in your society, then maybe your society is not fair. So I want to apply this to the example of healthcare, because that is a very live question right now in our political arena, right, in the sort of boxing match that is the U.S. election right now. So when we think about Nozick, right, so we go back to liberty. Sort of, remember, you keep what you're entitled to keep, anything that you produce and earn. So when we think about healthcare, right, the only right with entitlement theory is to keep that which you've earned. So healthcare would not be a right. It would be, again, something you would purchase privately, right? If you want to give into a particular sort of charitable account that allows others to access healthcare, then that you're entitled to do so. But you should not be required to pay for other people's healthcare, right? It's not a right. The only right in that theory is, right, to keep what you earn. Okay, so private insurance would be that particular approach, and having the kind of healthcare that you can afford and that you've worked for. Okay. And then hopefully everybody else would be, I think the idea there is everybody else would be motivated to work hard so they could have the kind of healthcare that they want and need. When we get to Rawls, I think you have much more of an argument for at least a right to access to healthcare, because that would then allow you to pursue those positions that are open to all. Okay. I think that's the most basic form of healthcare, and that's what you see in things like Obamacare or Medicare or Medicaid, alongside that private option, would go along with that difference principle. So long as the most basic form of healthcare is something that you would accept, right, behind the veil of ignorance, if you didn't know what you were going to get and what your economic status was, then that would be a fair system, right, of healthcare. When we get to Marx, and you see this with certain elements within kind of left politics in the US, only certain segments, it's certainly not the full Democratic platform. There's kind of pushes within the Democrats to ask for universal health care, and you saw a lot of that debate early on in the primaries of the Democrats, right, in terms of should we allow for private insurance still, should it be a public option, all of those discussions. So they're definitely not in agreement here. But if you're taking a Marxist approach, right, then I think you would be asking for universal health care, right, so that the right to the same health care for everybody would ensure equal ability to pursue labor that is meaningful to you, right? As opposed to in our current system, a lot of people take jobs, right? I know I have in the past, and plenty of people in my orbit as well, and maybe you have as well. You take a particular job because of the healthcare, not because, right, it's a job where you're connected to your own creativity and connected to your own labor, right? And so having that universal health care sort of takes, right, that choice out of circulation for people. If people don't have to choose jobs because they need health care, but because they actually feel connected to the job and the labor, then you get closer to Marx's ideal. So I hope this was a little bit helpful for you to think about some of these theories, and then the very important issue of healthcare that right now more than ever and in a pandemic is one that we need to address. So I hope at least some people take this and use it as either a final project topic, healthcare, or maybe an example within your sociopolitical essay. And if you have any other questions and you want me to work you through some deductive arguments, please use Ask the Instructor so that we can have other people kind of learning along with us. All right, thanks.